About 120 years ago, Mark Twain famously wrote that faith is believing what you know ain't so. I've come to the conclusion that he was right, sort of. But he was also wrong, sort of. What Twain tapped into was an understanding that we are creatures of faith. We are creatures of trust. And we put our faith and our trust in things, and I'll formulate this a little bit differently from Twain. We put our trust and faith in things that we don't know are so. And we do that every day. For instance, my understanding of aerodynamics is limited to what our science teacher, Mr. Schmidt, taught us in 7th grade. And it's also what I observe when I stick my hand out the car window when it's moving. Change the angle of attack on your hand, and it either goes down or it goes up. That's what I know. My understanding of jet engines and avionics is even less than that. But that lack of understanding, the lack of knowing for myself, doesn't keep me from boarding a plane when I need to fly somewhere. Because I have faith that this giant metal tube that I'm sitting in is somehow going to get off the ground when it's supposed to. And hopefully come back to Earth when it's supposed to, and not before. I have faith and trust in the people who built it and the people who fly it, people who maintain it, people who direct air traffic. I have faith, and it's an unspoken, even unthinking faith, really, that comes from the modern age, that every person whose job has something to do with me getting on that flight and going where I intend to go is doing their job to their utmost ability. And faith that the laws of physics and aerodynamics are not going to suddenly change in mid-flight. And to think about that kind of faith, you don't even have to go to something as exotic, if you want to call it that, as air travel. Because just driving a car, unless you're Charlton Heston driving through the empty streets of LA in Omega Man, unless you're him, just driving a car is an act of faith. So any day when you get behind the wheel and you start the car, you've got faith and trust that the car is going to get you where you're going. That's not always rewarded. And you have faith that other drivers, not most drivers, but every driver you encounter is going to drive their vehicle in a way that won't kill you. Again, not always rewarded. But despite that, we have faith. Going through a green light at a busy intersection is an act of faith, because we are trusting that somebody's not going to run that light. We're creatures of faith. Every day in 100 ways we act on faith, and we do things based on our trust in people and things that we can't possibly know for ourselves. So what separates us and that kind of faith from the faith of Abram in today's reading from Genesis? Because the epistle reading, Hebrews, holds Abram up as a hero of faith, as a great example for us to follow. And when you look at the reading in Genesis and before and after, we know that God was making promises to Abram like a politician running for office. You're going to have this. Have that. Your ancestors will have this. Chicken in every pot. Cart in every garage. God promised a new and exciting future if Abram to start with, would just pack up and leave. Just pack up. Leave behind everything you know. Everything that makes you safe and comfortable. Leave that all behind and move to this new land, because it's going to be good for you. And then God promised Abram in that wonderful moment where God tells him to go out and look up in the sky and count the stars. He promises him that he's going to have more descendants than he could ever imagine. And that those descendants would rule this strange new land that he had been called to. And even though Abram had already shown his faith and his trust by uprooting his life and by doing what God had said to this point, in the midst of today's conversation, when God is telling him about his many offspring and what's going to happen, Abram asked a question that many of us at some point in our lives may have struggled with. Because after God promises him that his descendants will one day own this land, Abram very respectfully asks, God, how can I know that? God, you've promised a lot of great things. You have promised a future of glory for descendants I don't even have. How can I know this is going to happen? And God at this point chooses to speak in a language or a form that Abram would understand. And he goes from simply making promises to making a covenant. Nowadays, if we want to make a covenant, a solemn, formally, legally binding agreement, we have a lawyer draw it up and we sign it. Maybe we'll have it notarized. But 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, lawyers were in short supply, and in this area of the world, writing was still something of a fad. So the process was a little different. In order to make a covenant 4,000 years ago in the land of Abram, first you dug a trench. And then you collected a few animals, a heifer, a goat, maybe an ox, whatever seemed appropriate. And then, and this part was a little hard on the animals, you cut them in half, and you take a half of the animal and you put one on each side of this trench that was dug. And they were arranged in such a way that the blood would flow into the trench and along the trench. And then the parties to the agreement, party of the first part, party of the second part, they would walk down that trench between these divided animals. It probably signified that if they broke this agreement, they would end up like these unfortunate creatures. This was a common occurrence. This was how covenants were done. So when God said that to Abram, it made sense. And it told him that God was making a solemn promise. And to us today, it makes all that paperwork that we have to do sometimes look a lot more attractive. And then when everything was suitably prepared, the animals had been taken care of, and the trench was dug and everything, God caused this deep and dreadful darkness to fall upon Abram, and he fell asleep. And God prophesied about the captivity of his descendants in Egypt and how they would one day return and take ownership of this land. And then there's this fantastic bit of imagery where a flaming torch and a smoking fire pot appear out of the darkness, and they walk or they move down this trench of covenant. Now, apart from being the 4,000-year-old version of a contract, this was also kind of a look forward. Because in context, you can think that the darkness that fell upon Abram might well have been a reflection of the darkness that fell upon the mountains of Sinai when God came down to the people of Israel after they had fled from Egypt. And the flaming torch and the smoking fire pot, they were certainly reflections of the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke that would lead them out of Egypt. These were signs for a future generation to understand, and when they're looking back at the covenant. So, how did they help Abram? And the answer is, these things, these images didn't help Abram themselves, because he wasn't convinced by a sudden appearance of God or by prophetic imagery, but he was convinced because, in a way that he could relate to, God had made a covenant with him. He made a covenant with Abram's hypothetical unborn children. And in his time and place, covenants just weren't broken. There's a school of thought that believes that Abram, because Abram didn't walk this covenant path, but God did, probably or possibly at least in two different persons. There's a school of thought that God essentially, with this covenant, bound himself to the terms of the agreement, but chose not to have Abram walk that same covenant path because he knew that Abram couldn't make promises for future generations. But God knew that he could promise things in perpetuity. So for Abram, the question, how can I know that all of these things that God has offered, has told me, are going to be true? The answer is, he knew because God made a covenant with him. And when the creator of the universe makes a promise, you can count on it. When the creator of the universe says, I have plans for you. If you're smart, you say, okay. If you're stubborn, you say, oh, maybe not right now. But that's another story. When the Creator says, I have plans, you say, yes, sir, what are they? And wouldn't it be nice to know what those plans are day by day and week by week? Would it be nice to know exactly what's going to happen? Of course it would. We're creatures of faith, but we're also creatures that like to know. The only trouble is those plans that God has for us, they involve human beings, and you know what they're like. God's plans for us, each of us, and God's plans for this church and for His church in general, those plans involve a world with 6 or 7 billion moving parts. All of those parts having free will, and that means that more than likely we're making up the details as we go along. And that's where faith comes in. Because we're not going to know the details. That's just how life is. God told Abram what would happen. He told him some of what would happen, but He didn't give him all of the gory details and all of the things that would happen among His children. descendants. Because those details were still in the making. Why burden him with all of that grief? But we can have faith that God has a plan for us, as Jeremiah said, that He has plans for good and not for evil. We can also be pretty sure that things are going to happen along the way that seem like they can't possibly be part of this plan. Somehow they're just another moving part. I have a friend, a very good friend, who for as long as I've known her has always been looking for the sign. The sign that this, whatever this is what she's supposed to do. But one of the great benefits of faith is that we can look ahead. We can look at the road and we can know that the sign we're going to see most often is road work ahead. Under construction. Because our road is still being built. It's being built by us. And by the people around us and by countless other people whose lives touch ours in ways that we can't even understand. Faith means that we can say, okay. That's okay because I know where this road ends. I don't know where the twists and turns are going to be along the way. I don't know what the speed limit's going to be. I'll probably go a little faster. But I know it gets there. We'll just have to see. Faith is the assurance, we're told, of things not seen, of things that we know nonetheless. Faith is a state of mind that says, I know God loves me, and because I know that, I can deal with whatever else happens along the way. Faith is the intersection of free will and conviction. It's a gift from the Creator who loves us and equips us for an unpredictable journey. I was thinking this week that maybe when it comes to our faith, the question of how can we know is maybe less important than the question of how can we show. How can we show our faith? Because when we do that, we help others find theirs.